Leonard Moore's first assignment to those who take his massively popular history course baffles some of his students. They're a racially diverse group, white fraternity bros learning alongside hijab-wearing Muslim women and African national and African American students. He asks them all to write an essay on how the Black experience has shaped them. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Moore has found their essays to be illuminating about racial dynamics in this country. And he thinks all of us, whatever our identity, could benefit from considering the question he poses to his students and from making the effort to know more about the African American experience in the United States than just stories of enslavement, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King. For those of us who can't take his class at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is the George Littlefield Professor of American History, he's written a brief but illuminating book called Teaching Black History to White People. Leonard, welcome to Think.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
You state right off the top that every white person in America should be required to take a Black history course either in high school or in college. What changes when those of us outside the Black community start to understand the ways that race has shaped life in this country?
Thank you, Chris. Chris, I don't think you can really understand, American history or this, experiment at democracy without understanding the Black experience. I tell my students all the time, Black folk have been here since 1619, and the majority of white people came, 1840s, biggest wave 1840s, then another wave, around the turn of the century. And so I don't think most Americans realize that when we talk about what it means to be American, that Black people are a critical part of that. We were here at the birth of this country. We were here before the birth of the country. And in so many ways, Chris, the fabric of American society, I would argue, is there's a thread of Blackness all throughout it. And so you can't understand American history without understanding Black people.
So you believe so strongly in this that you've taken it upon yourself to provide this kind of education to as many people as will open their minds to it. What's your response to folks who argue it should not be the responsibility of Black people to teach white people all the things we white people have failed to learn?
Well, that's what my aunt told me. And I appreciated her perspective. But my point is, if we aren't going to teach it, then who will? You know what I mean? I'm about teaching an accurate Black history. And I think that those of us who are built for, everybody's not built like me, Chris, to go into all white, hardcore conservative environments and give this message. You know what I mean? But I've had a lot of success at it. So I would just encourage people, it may not be our responsibility, it may not be our obligation, but it's something we should be willing to do.
So of all the things in your book that might come as new information to people or surprising, the fact that there's a chapter titled Why I Like Teaching Black History in the South might be number one. Yeah. What makes the South a good place to dive into this subject?
Chris, people in the South are straightforward. They're not concerned about political correctness, and they'll just be straight up with you. And I like to tell one story. I was invited to speak to a group of wealthy men in Austin, Texas. And the name of the group, Chris, was called the Lakeway Men's Club. Lakeway is an affluent suburb right outside of Austin. And when I said the Lakeway Men's Club, some of your listeners, an image went into their mind, right? And the image that they thought of, that's the Lakeway Men's Club, all right? It's about 100 white men who meet 50 Tuesdays out of the year at 7 a.m. in the morning. So they invited me to speak. And even before the gentleman got up to introduce me, as he was passing out my bio, Chris, 10 people got up and walked out. And I said, man, I haven't even said anything yet.
Wow.
And so when I started to talk, I took two of my graduate assistants with me, two Black males, for two reasons. Number one, I wanted them to see the experience. But number two, I may have needed some protection getting out of the building because I don't hold my tongue, Chris, no matter where I'm at. So anyway, Chris, I threw him a curveball. I told my students, I said, watch this. I'm not going to say anything about race. I'm not going to say anything about, not about politics. I'm going to just talk about all these students I take abroad every summer. So anyway, when I finished talking, Chris, I spoke for 20 minutes. Again, I didn't say anything about race. An older white man raised his hand. He said, well, Dr. Moore? I said, yes. He said, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? I said, well, I didn't say anything about Black Lives Matter. I said, but sir, I can tell you've been waiting 2 or 3 years to find a Black person to ask this question to. So just like the Price is Right, come on down. Today is your day. And his response, Chris, Dr. Moore, if y'all would obey the police, you wouldn't get shot. So when he said it, I'm going to be tactful in how I respond. I just said, so let me ask you a question. Do you believe there are bad football coaches? He said, yes. Do you believe there are bad business owners? He said, yes. Do you believe there are bad investment bankers? He said, yes. Do you believe there are bad teachers? Yes. I said, so how come we can't have bad cops? But what I appreciate about him coming is that when he came at me like that, Chris, we can just go back and forth. And I like the South because that's where they are. And let me give you another example. I was at the University of Oregon for a VP interview about 5 years ago. Listen to this, Chris. They asked me, well, Dr. Moore, what do you think your greatest accomplishment has been as an administrator in your 20 years of working at a university? I said, the dynamic work I have done with Black males. Chris, here's the white liberal response that I didn't like. They told me, well, that sounds like a very gendered and sexist response. I said, man, I'm getting the hell out of here. And so my point is, Chris, I like the South because there's no political correctness. And what I have found is that white Southerners, they are more inclined to have these conversations than I think white folks are in the Northeast or on the West Coast.
Are white Southerners inclined to really pay attention to what you have to say and change their thinking accordingly?
At Chris, right now, I am teaching a 4-week Black history class. Listen to this now, with 100 judges from the state of Texas, and 94 of them are white. And I'm not talking about necessarily from the urban areas. I'm talking about the Panhandle, West Texas, East Texas. And what I find is that they want to know about the history. Now, here's the thing, Chris. They don't want you pointing the finger at them, calling them the oppressor. You know what I mean? But a good teacher can lay out the evidence, and intelligent people come to the conclusion of their own.
So you were teaching a class about the Black Power movement in 2014 when Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, and you noticed the essential questions your students raised about this, about the how could this happen, were fundamentally different depending on their race.
Absolutely. I mean, I tell the story all the time that I teach a class at the University of Texas Law School every spring semester, and had a white kid in my class, about 27 years of age, and we were talking about the police. He said he's never had any kind of interaction with the police, good or bad. I said, the police have never stopped you. You've never been frisked or nothing. He said nothing. And too often, when we talk about like police interaction, many of my white colleagues still don't understand why I get nervous whenever I'm driving down I-35 from my house to campus. They don't understand why I get terrified. And because they don't know the legacy in many ways, I would say, of police mistreatment, which is often supported by a racist district attorney, you know what I mean, and a racist criminal justice system. So a lot of my colleagues, Chris, look at me as the exception. Oh, Leonard, I can't believe you would have a problem with the police. Why not? They know me as Dr. Moore, but the police don't. Quick story, Chris. I was doing some work with the Appalachian State football team, okay? And I knew I was going to fly into Charlotte, and I knew I had a 2-hour drive from Charlotte to the campus, okay? And so when I looked at my itinerary and I saw how far it was from Charlotte to the campus, I went upstairs and changed clothes because I had to get to the airport. Now, I tell my students that as a Black man, if I'm going to be driving on the highway at night, I am very conscious of how I dress. So, Chris, I had on slacks and a shirt. I took that off, and I have some University of Texas Nike coaching gear in my closet. A polo, a windbreaker with the Nike sign on one side and the Longhorn logo on the other side of the chest, a baseball cap, some khaki pants. And here is why, Chris. They said, Dr. Moore, why would you dress like that? I said, because if a white cop pulled me over late at night in rural North Carolina, I could camouflage my race by having on all this University of Texas Longhorns gear, and we can have a discussion about football, and that will put the cop at ease.
So if a white person says to you, well, I don't have problems with the cops, it can't be that bad, it's like me saying migraines aren't that bad, except that I don't get migraines.
Right. No, and so what it is, Chris, I tell people, when I tell white people when I'm teaching these courses, I tell them, I don't care who you vote for. Because, see, underlying all of this stuff is people feel like you're trying to indoctrinate them or get them to change their political belief. What I tell them is, I'm not trying to get you to change how you vote for. All I'm saying is that as someone who's going to be culturally intelligent, you have to value other perspectives. You ain't got to agree with it. You don't have to adopt it. After the Trump election, Me and my wife, and we live in a cul-de-sac, we invited five couples over. They were all white. Well, one was Mexican, but they wanted to be white. So 4 white couples, 1 Mexican couple who wanted to be white, and then us. And we just had an open, honest discussion, Chris, about why they voted for Trump. Somebody said, well, I think he'll represent Christian principles. Somebody else said, well, I'm a business owner. I think he'll be good for the economy. And to a person, they had a legitimate reason why they voted for Trump. Whether or not I agreed with that reason didn't matter, but in their mind, they came to voting, they came to a logical conclusion that voting for Trump would be better than him. I tell people, I listen to Rush Limbaugh every day whenever I got in my car in the afternoon. You know why? Because I valued the perspective that Rush brought, and I knew that he was speaking for millions of white folks who felt they didn't have a voice.
How do you help your students understand the lasting repercussions of many decades of Black voter suppression? What is it that you walk them through to sort of get them to that place?
Well, I like to give a monopoly example that I talk about in the book, and I would like to share it here. And I know many of you, I know you got a bunch of smart listeners. So imagine if we sit down to play the game Monopoly. I'm playing with 7 of my white colleagues. We pick a piece: the horse, the shoe, the car, the thimble, the iron, whatever. And, we get money. Everybody gets $50, $100 each. They tell me I get $750 because I'm Black, and I'm ready to play. I'm ready to roll the dice. I'm ready to be competitive, okay? But they tell me, Chris, now, Leonard, you can't buy any property until you roll for the 20th time. And I'm like, that's not fair. But they say that's in the rules. You can't buy any property till you roll for the 20th time, but you can move around the board. You can pay taxes. You can pay rent. And because you are Black, you can go to jail. All right? So, Chris, I'm competitive. I'm smart. I've been to school. So despite the obstacle, I'm excited now. I'm about to roll for the 20th time, and now I can buy property. But here's the catch, Chris. When I look around the board, all the property has been bought. It's all gone. And so now I have no money, I have no property, and there is no way for me to get money and property. And somebody walks in the house, they observe the game, and they say, Leonard, where's your money and property? And I'm like, no, man, the rules. They say, Leonard, that happened a long time ago. You are lazy, you want the government to take care of you, and you want to blame white people. Pause right there. So let's say all 7 of us get up and go to dinner, and our kids take our place, all right? So our kids sit down in the chair, they get our piece, and we pass down whatever property and money we have to our children. My daughter Lauren sits in my chair. All the other white parents, their kids sitting in their chair, they have property, they have money. My daughter Lauren has nothing. They say, Lauren, how come you don't have any money or property? And she says, because y'all discriminated against my daddy during Jim Crow. And they say, you can't blame me for that, Lauren. That happened a long time ago. If you would just work hard enough, you would get some property and some money. White America does not realize what Jim Crow did to the African American community. They have no idea how destructive that was to our spirit of industry and our spirit of entrepreneurship.
Teaching this class has also given you a unique perspective on the perceptions of African American students as compared with their peers whose families are recently from Africa. How have students with backgrounds in Africa, African countries, been taught to see their African American peers?
I'll say this, Chris, it's been one of the most disappointing things I've had to deal with as a professor. Not all, there are always exceptions, but in too many cases, I'll have, African students tell me that when they came here, they were being raised, they were told by their parents, don't fool with African American people. They're lazy, they're shiftless, they don't value education. You may look like them, but you aren't one of them. And what amazes me, Chris, and why this is so hurtful is because many of these immigrants from Nigeria, parts of East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, they don't realize that it was civil rights legislation that even allowed them to come in the country. And so you come to America for more opportunity, but then you get here and you look down on the people who have created the opportunity for you. And I find it to be very arrogant. And I find in many ways, too many of our brothers and sisters from the continent come over here with those negative attitudes towards Black people.
When you write that you yourself didn't really understand the scope of African enslavement until you got to college, what do you mean by that?
Well, I knew a little bit about it growing up in Cleveland, but I got to college, I just learned a lot about it, and then when I started teaching at LSU, I started doing these plantation tours, and I I just really got immersed in it. And what amazes me is that, it's people, we talking about taking down the Confederate statues. People say we shouldn't whitewash history, but then you want to whitewash enslavement. You want to whitewash the teaching of lynchings. So I tell Americans, we can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. And I think this country still hasn't come to grips with the 200-year period of enslavement, because as African Americans, those psychological effects and material effects are still there.
Your classes are racially mixed. I'm curious about what you've learned about crafting lessons that work for students who may have felt the negative effects of racism their whole lives, alongside students who might arrive in your lecture hall assuming racism is like a thing of the past or something that they are not responsible for.
Well, let me say this. I tell people my class is not a safe space. I will not give trigger warnings. I believe in freedom of speech and the First Amendment. So literally, you can say anything in my class you want. You're not going to incite violence, and you aren't going to, say hateful things. But other than that, and I tell my students, even the woke students, you have to be comfortable in an environment where people are expressing views that you disagree with. So I always have a bunch of Trump supporters in my class, and the reason they like it, they say, Dr. Moore, we like your class because you let us voice our opinions and you don't shut us down. So I don't really give a whole lot of thought to that, Chris. I do remember what the Honorable Marcus Garvey said over 100 years ago. He said, if you are teaching Black history, it should show white America how Black people have been treated, but at the same time, it should inspire Black people to continue towards greatness.
So you also want your students to understand the informal codes of Jim Crow that harmed Black people, not just the things that were written down in laws, but the things that affected folks. And one of the things you explain is that these informal codes forced a lot of intelligent Black people to act dumb. How did that play out, and why did it happen?
I like to tell the story of president of Grambling State University. He had a brilliant name, Ralph Waldo Emerson Jones, all right? Born in the South, went to graduate school at Columbia, was president of Grambling in the 30s, 40s, early 50s. And the reason, if you look at a lot of Black folk who had PhDs and advanced degrees back then from the South, they were from Ivy League schools in places like Ohio State, Michigan, UCLA, because the Southern states did not want them to go to graduate school there. So they would give them money to go somewhere else, like a scholarship, to go somewhere else. And so anyway, very intelligent brother, smoked a pipe, wore a suit every day. But he said that whenever he came to the state capitol in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to meet with politicians, he would drive to North Baton Rouge, Black part of town. He would stay at a friend's house. He would take his suit off, put on some overalls and some work boots. He would dishevel his hair, take the pipe out of his mouth. He would put some tobacco juice on him and have it kind of dripping out of his mouth. And he would borrow somebody's beat up pickup truck to drive to the state capitol. And somebody said, well, Dr. Jones, why are you doing it? He said, because I have to give them the impression that I am dumb. I have to give them the impression that I am country and that I'm not educating Black folk in Grambling, that I'm just in many ways training them to be subservient. And I would say, Chris, some of that stuff still goes on now. Even Black people. I know Black people who have Teslas and Range Rovers. And Chris, they will not drive it to work because the feeling is that if your white boss or coworker sees you with something that they have better than them, then somehow you will be punished for it. So, Chris, this stuff still carries over into now 2021.
What do standard versions of American history leave out of the story of the Great Migration?
They don't really talk about, I think there's a lot of emphasis placed on, Black folks leaving for jobs. Yeah, that was only about 20% of it. They were trying to get the hell out of the South, plain and simple. And I think we may have in many ways overestimated the economic piece to a certain extent. That may have been true with the first migration after World War I. But we talk about the second Great Migration between 1945 and 1965. It is just trying to get away from that terror in the South. And they also don't talk about, and this is a good point, Chris, they don't talk about the efforts white Southerners took to keep Black folks in the South. So imagine if you're Black, you can't vote, you're getting lynched, you're segregated in all areas of life. They don't want you to get a quality education. You're being sharecropped. The criminal justice system is manipulated to get you in the system and get you back on the field through convict leasing. But now when you want to leave and better yourself, They like, no, we got to come up with laws to keep them here. So I don't think anybody's aware of the great lengths white Southerners used to keep black folks in the South because they didn't want to lose their labor force.
There are other stories you share here that are more complicated than many of us may have learned in our classes. You remind us that desegregation, as important as it was, had some unintended consequences for black school teachers and business owners.
Chris, I would argue that we need to completely reevaluate the Brown decision in 1954. That was 46, almost 77 years ago. And here's the thing: on the eve of the Brown decision, when the NAACP was financing these court cases, and let me say this: I don't know in the history of the world where any black parent thought that their kid would be smarter just by sitting next to a white kid. Okay. So I believe black parents wanted equity. They wanted their schools equally funded. But here is what black teachers predicted on the eve of the Brown decision. Three things. Number one, they predicted that black schools, if schools were integrated, that black schools would completely be shut down. The second thing they predicted is that black teachers would lose their jobs, and about 40,000 teachers lost their jobs. But here's the third thing they predicted, Chris, and this is what we are dealing with in terms of black education today. They said that teaching as a profession among black people would decline in status. And they said that before the Brown decision, and all three of those things have happened. And we are dealing with the legacy of that today. So we really need to reevaluate this idea of school integration. And has it really been helpful to us? I don't think so.
So don't enforce the laws that require integration? I mean, one could argue that a lot of schools are segregated anyway these days.
Right. Well, here's what they did in Indianapolis, Indiana. Crispus Attucks High School. It was a high school established in Indianapolis, the late 1920s. And I know because my grandmother was valedictorian there in 1931. So in Indianapolis, Chris, in the 20s, the black community was kind of, they were kind of separated all throughout the city. So there was no like Indianapolis black community. They came together. They told the school district, we want an all black high school. So they wanted an all black learning environment. They got it in Indianapolis, Crispus Attucks High School. And in the 1930s, Chris, it was the best high school in America. And I think per capita, that high school had more teachers with PhDs than any other high school in the country.
You have some tips at the end of the book for ways that we can all sort of improve how we think about these things and think about them in a more realistic way. The first thing I want to ask you is, you already said that you don't care if your students change their political affiliation. That's not really what you're interested in. Do you think your classes cause many of your white students in particular to act in ways that work against white supremacy?
You know, I don't know, but I like to tell a quick story. I had a white student who took my class. I talk about this in the book, and she said, well, Dr. Moore, you know, my mom didn't want me to take the class. I said, why not? She felt that this class would indoctrinate me. And I said, oh, okay. I said, well, what made her change her mind? She said, well, she told me I could take the class, but I had to send her the syllabus. My mom reads all the books. And listen to this, Chris. The lecture was on Tuesdays and Thursdays. After every class, the student had to email her mom the notes, and they went over the course material in depth every Tuesday and Thursday night. Here's how God works. The mom sends me an email in December, and she said, Dr. Moore, you know, I didn't want my daughter to take your class. You know, I thought you were going to destroy her mind and turn her to a liberal. She said, but I've read all the books. She said, you have triggered a thirst for Black history within me and my family. And she said, our entire outlook on race in America has changed. And she said, I just want to thank you. Yes, I don't care. Because here's the thing, Chris, I'm not trying to, I don't care who you vote for, because once you are presented with the history, once it is presented to you, your heart will change. That's guaranteed.
By the way, this word indoctrinate, when people say, I don't want you to indoctrinate my child, what does that word mean?
No, what it means is we've taught our daughter X, Y, and Z. And so now she's in your Black history class. And basically, she's about to learn what really happened and not what we told her. And so what happens is then the kids go home over Thanksgiving break or fall break, and they're asking the parents questions. You know, Mom, why did you have me in an all-white school where there were no Black people or no Mexicans? And so those conversations for parents are a little bit uncomfortable.
You leave us, as I said, with some thoughts on improving the racial climate, starting with imploring us to go ahead and see color. When you say see color, what do you mean? Well,
we all see it. You know, my students know me as, quote, the Black professor. They're Black professor. And what I tell people, and I understand when they say they don't want to see color, it means they don't want to stereotype, right? But I'm saying you got to see color. Every year in my classes, I teach 1,000 students every fall semester, Chris. I'll have about 40 students who are undocumented, right? Now, I have to see them as undocumented because here's why. Whenever they get a text message, they're thinking, did somebody get deported? Whenever somebody walks in the lecture hall, after the bell rings, they're thinking, is ICE coming to get me? So I have to understand that their experience is different. Also, I'll have about 10 to 15 Muslim women in my class who wear a hijab. Now, I need to notice them because they probably deal with the level of surveillance, a lot of Islamophobia. Their experiences in Texas is probably going to be like any other. So here's the deal. When you see race, I tell people it is not about stereotyping. And it's not about treating everybody the same. It is about treating everybody fairly. And I think there is a difference between treating everybody the same and everybody fairly. So we got to see race.
Talk about the difference between treating everybody the same and treating everybody fairly, because I think some people get really hung up on that.
So, for instance, when I was in my vice president role at the University of Texas at Austin for 4 years, I managed a team of 400 people. Single moms and moms with young children, I didn't treat them the same as everybody else. I knew some of those women needed to come to work a little later and needed the flexibility in their workday because of childcare stuff. So it wasn't about giving them preferential treatment, right? I just understood their situation. But too often, I think as a manager or a leader, it is a cop-out to say you treat everybody the same because in America, our experience is often different, particularly around issues of race.
How can we do a better job of recognizing our own biases? Nobody really, even when we say I'm biased, we don't really believe that we hold biases.
Yeah. I mean, I have them and I had to be honest with them. I have two. I held biases a long time for people from very elite universities. I thought they were lazy. I thought they were privileged. They were coddled, didn't really want to work. They wanted to live off the name of the school on their diploma. And I also, used to stereotype, and I talk about this in the book. There was a white student who came to my office one day, Chris, when I was at LSU. And if you looked up white sorority girl in a dictionary, Chris, that was her. Mm-hmm. Blonde hair, blue eyes. And when I saw her sitting outside my office, I made a number of assumptions. She's rich. She's in one of these wealthy sororities. She really doesn't have to go to college. And she's here trying to get a grade that she doesn't want to work for. Chris, do you know what? We sat there talking. She talked about how her and her mom spent 3 years living in a battered women's shelter when she was in high school, and how her dorm room at LSU was the first time her entire life that she had her own bed. And so I had to just be open and honest about my biases, and I had to check it. And I said, well, I thought you were one of those rich girls in those sororities. She said, Dr. Moore, even if I could afford it, I don't even like those girls. And so we just got to be open and honest with what those biases are.
What can we do to stop committing microaggressions or saying microaggressions to people that are really hurt by them?
I tell them microaggressions, it's not one big thing. It's just the accumulation of about 20 small things. Uh-huh. I was at a faculty senate meeting 3 years ago, Chris. Now, I've been a professor 24, got my PhD in 1998. I was at a faculty senate meeting. The basketball coach was there talking about, the basketball team and how they do academically. And when it was over, one of my white colleagues, now I'm an endowed professor, Chris, I think that means something. One of my white colleagues pointed at me and I overheard him say, ask him, he's an assistant basketball coach. And Chris, you will be surprised when I tell people I work at the University of Texas, they always want to associate me with the athletic enterprise. I must be a coach. I must be a scout. Me and my son were flew into San Francisco. I went to get the rental car. My profile came up. It said UT Austin. And the guy said, oh, hey, Mr. Moore, welcome to San Francisco. Are you here recruiting? And I said, recruiting who? He said, recruiting athletes. And my son, who was 10 at the time, started busting out laughing because he knows these stereotypes or these microaggressions that his dad deals with on a daily basis.
Why do you think people are so bothered? Some people are so bothered by the fact that you and others like you are pointing out microaggressions. Why has this become such a sticking point in this culture?
I don't know. I think. Well, let me say this: Black folk don't complain nearly as much as we should. So let me say that we tolerate a whole lot. The president of UT had a Christmas dinner 2 years ago. I was black vice president, dean of the graduate school, is a black man. He's 68 years old, 6'5", former Olympian. I was at the time 47. I walk up, he walks up. They give him a badge that says Leonard Moore on it. Then they give me his badge. And he was like, Leonard, it's only two of us. You would think they could get that right. You know what I'm saying? But we deal with it all the time, but we don't complain. We rarely complain about this stuff. I think people don't want to do the extra work. I mean, I think it's easy to look at people through a stereotype because then I don't have to work.
Do you still learn things from the responses of your students in your Black history classes?
Absolutely, Chris. I tell people, when I'm teaching 1,000 students in one semester, I like to call it reverse mentoring. Those 18 to 24-year-old students have helped me become a better father, a better husband, a better person, and a better professor. And I think we have a good relationship. And I tell people all the time, they say, Doctor, well, how do you get all these white kids in your class? I say, hey, I think they know that I love them. You know what I mean? And I treat them as a person, and I am genuinely concerned in many ways about their welfare. But I'm always learning from them, and they've taught me some great lessons in life.
What do you do when a student says something, perhaps out of ignorance, but that is really hurtful, not just to you, but maybe to other students in the class?
I remind students that we're all on a journey that we're learning, you know what I mean? And I tell the students, hey, don't judge this person by that comment. The fact that they had to, I'm proud that they were courageous enough to raise their hand. And so what we have to stop doing, you got to quit shouting people down. You know what I mean? And I remember a few years ago, when I was running the VP operation at Texas Over Diversity, we'd host these workshops, and I would hop in the workshop sometimes. And I'm like, you know what? If I was attending this workshop, I would get up and walk out, because you can't make these assumptions that every man is sexist, that just because somebody believes in traditional marriage, that means they're homophobic and all this kind of stuff. But what I saw is that we were creating these litmus tests, Chris, right? Where if you didn't answer the question the right way, people want to punish you and penalize you. And I'm like, no, we got to give everybody grace to grow and learn.
You said the most important question would-be allies can ask is, what can I help you fight for, rather than what can I do? Why is what can I help you fight for a more effective question?
Because too often white liberals think they know what's best for Black people. And I'll give one example. I was called to mediate a dispute at a law school in the South. It was between a Black professor and some students. And the professor put a question on the law exam that said, defend school segregation from a legal perspective. So defend basically school segregation. I thought it was a brilliant question. It's law school. It's an academic exercise. The students went crazy. They said they were triggered. They were traumatized by the question. So when this dean of the law school called me, and I went over there to mediate this dispute, I said, it's going to be a bunch of white students in this room. Watch. It was 13 students, Chris, one Black, one Mexican, and the ringleader was this 31-year-old white man who said he was so traumatized by the question and that the professor should lose his job. And I asked a simple question. I said, this law school admitted 275 students last year. How many were Black? And they got quiet. I said 9 were Black. And I said, why don't you all spend more time on that than a question? Because all you're doing now is, we call it performative justice, right? They were performing, but if you were to ask Black folks at that school what they wanted most out of the law school, they wanted more Black students.
All right, I have to jump in and end here. Leonard Moore is George Littlefield Professor of American History at UT Austin and author of Teaching Black History to White People. Leonard, thank you very much for spending this time with us.
Thank you.
I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.